My mother ended her life by jumping from the hospital roof. This tragedy left me emotionless, but my mother's doctor was clearly shaken. She persistently called me, informing me about what had happened and demanding that I come immediately. I turned off my phone and calmly continued eating sunflower seeds while watching a TV show. In another life, when I received a similar call, I rushed to the hospital in a frenzy, completely losing myself. But all I found there was my mother's lifeless body. The doctor explained that, before her death, my mother had complained about cruelty and abuse at the hands of her daughter, which had caused her to end up in the hospital multiple times. Unable to bear it any longer, she chose suicide. Even my husband accused me of allegedly mistreating her. But it was all a lie. I had cared for her and respected her since childhood. I had never raised my voice at her, let alone harmed her. However, during the autopsy, the medical examiner found old and new scars on her arms and legs. These marks were taken as evidence of prolonged abuse. I was falsely accused of causing my mother's death. In the end, I was imprisoned, where I was brutally tortured until it led to my death. Until my last breath, I couldn't comprehend how a woman who had been hospitalized for a mere allergy observation could end her life. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself back on the day of her death. "Didn't you say you wanted dumplings yesterday?" A familiar voice spoke up. My husband Ethan, smiling warmly, served me breakfast he had made especially for me. But instead of gratitude, I felt a chill and unease. Ethan lived with us, devoting himself to taking care of my mother and me. Everyone said I was incredibly lucky to have such a kind and caring husband. If he hadn't betrayed me and publicly accused me in my past life, I would have continued to believe in his gentleness and kindness. "Why are you staring at me like that?" "Eat up," he said with a smile, as if nothing had happened. I suppressed my anger and sat at the table. Across from me, my mother sat peacefully with a bowl of porridge. Looking at her, I couldn't hold back my tears. Today would be the last day of her life. After breakfast and a visit to the hospital, she would once again end it all. I remembered holding her cold body, unable to believe what had happened. Then the doctor accused me of subjecting her to domestic violence. At that moment, I desperately hoped Ethan would defend me, but instead, he confirmed the doctor's claims. "I saw how cruel you were to her every day," he said. "She deserved love, not your abuse." His accusations turned me into a monster in the eyes of everyone around me. My attempts to explain were drowned out by the crowd's hatred. The medical examiner discovered numerous scars on my mother's body, which became irrefutable proof of my crime. "She's worse than an animal," people shouted. They threw stones and garbage at me, demanding my death. Soon, I was arrested and sent to prison, where the torment continued until I finally died.
Until I died, I couldn't figure out how my mother, whom I had taken great care of and who was just hospitalized for observation due to an allergy, could jump off the building with so many injuries all over her body. The pain of my previous life is still vivid in my mind. In this life, I must figure out everything. Just like in the previous life, after my mother finished having breakfast, Ethan spoke up. "Dr. Sophia said that Mom's allergy needs to be rechecked. I've already made an appointment. I'll take Mom there right now." When Ethan was about to take my mother out, I stopped them and said to my mother, "Mom, your sleeve is dirty. Let me wipe it for you." After saying that, I led her to the bathroom. Closing the door, I quickly rolled up my mother's sleeves and trouser legs to check. My mother was puzzled. "What are you doing?" "Nothing. Just checking how serious your allergy is," I replied casually, but my full attention was on her hands and feet. I could clearly see that there were no scars on her hands and feet at all. It was completely different from the hands and feet that were covered with scars in the previous life. So, what went wrong? Why were her hands and feet full of new and old scars just a few hours later? "Honey, are you done? The appointment time for the consultation is almost here." While I was racking my brains and couldn't figure it out, Ethan's knocking and urging voice came from outside the door. I opened the door and looked at Ethan. "I'll take Mom to the hospital today." Previously, It had always been Ethan who took my mother to the hospital, so when he heard what I said, a look of surprise clearly flashed in Ethan's eyes. But he didn't ask any more questions. Instead, he gave a slight smile. Sure. Then it'll be hard on you, honey. After saying that, he turned around and started clearing the dining table. His performance and reaction were so normal that there didn't seem to be a single problem. But the more it was like this, the more eager I was to find out the truth. On the way of driving my mother to the hospital, I couldn't help asking her, "Mom, how is Ethan treating you?" My mother smiled and said, "Ethan is just like my own son. He treats me very well." My mother's answer was natural and straightforward. Her kind smiling face was filled with contentment. I parked the car on the roadside and looked at her very seriously. "Mom, then what do you think of how I treat you?" My mother looked at me blankly and asked instead, "You're my precious daughter. How could you treat me badly?" After saying that, my mother also touched my head. "The thing that makes me happiest in this life is having such a cute and filial daughter like you." I gave a slight smile and didn't say anything more. I directly took my mother to the hospital. When taking my mother for the consultation, the attending doctor showed a surprised smile when she saw me. "Miss Grace, why are you accompanying Aunt Jo for the recheck today?" While speaking, the attending doctor very naturally helped my mother sit opposite her and gently took my mother's blood pressure. "I'm not too busy at the company today," I responded with a smile while observing the attending doctor without showing any signs. Only to see her give a slight smile, pat my mother's hand, and affectionately say, "Aunt Jo, look how much your daughter loves you. She's extremely busy with her work, yet she still went out of her way to take you to the hospital for a re-examination." The attending doctor's performance was kind and natural. Even the look in her eyes when she looked at my mother was full of genuine feelings. She didn't seem like a two-faced person who liked to pretend at all. But the more it was like this, the more confused I was. In the previous life, my mother often went to the hospital because of her allergy problems, and she always saw this doctor each time. She was easygoing and took special care of my mother. I had tried to give her gifts several times, but she refused, saying that taking care of patients was the doctor's responsibility and obligation, and no extra thanks were needed. In my heart, she was a good doctor who was responsible and full of love. But such an upright and easygoing doctor would publicly accuse me of being a vicious daughter who had been abusing my mother for a long time just a few hours later. I really couldn't figure out which link had gone wrong. After the consultation, the attending doctor said that my mother's condition was not very stable and she needed to be hospitalized for observation. After arranging a ward for my mother kept urging me, "Grace, you should go to work quickly. Don't let me affect your work. It's all an old problem of mine. It's not a big deal." I didn't leave. Instead, I stayed by her side without leaving an inch. There were still 3 hours before my mother jumped off the building. I didn't dare to be negligent. But until now, I was still in a state of being completely confused. Whenever I thought of my mother suddenly turning into a cold corpse, I would break out in a cold sweat all over my body. In the previous life, everything happened so suddenly that I was completely powerless to save the situation. In this life, I will never let the tragedy happen again. I sat in the ward, racking my brains but still couldn't figure it out. Why did I become a despised and unfilial daughter when I had done nothing? Why was my mother clearly fine but would be covered with old wounds all over her body and jump off the building to commit suicide 3 hours later? Why would my usually considerate husband and the upright and kind attending doctor suddenly change their faces and accuse me of crimes that I didn't commit? One question after another lingered in my mind, making me more and more confused. I knew clearly that everything was very wrong, but I couldn't tell exactly where the problem was. I could only try my best to recall everything in the previous life, trying to catch a single clue from it to solve my doubts. After thinking for a full 40 minutes, I suddenly had an inspiration and everything became clear. I walked out of the ward and found an empty corner to call my secretary. "Quick, help me check something." After instructing my secretary, I was on pins and needles, anxiously waiting for his news in the corridor. During the whole waiting process, my heart was beating very fast. I was eager to know if I was already close to the truth. After 10 minutes, the secretary called and told me his investigation results. Listening to his report, my hand holding the mobile phone couldn't stop trembling. Sure enough, everything was just as I had expected. I ordered in a solemn voice, "Do something for me, as quickly as possible, at all costs. Remember, don't tell anyone." After giving the instructions, I drove away from the hospital. 2 hours later, calls from the attending doctor came one after another. It seemed that she was extremely worried. Seeing that I didn't answer the calls all the time, she began to send text messages. "Miss Grace, something terrible has happened. Your mother jumped off the building and committed suicide in the hospital. Come here quickly. Miss Grace, why don't you answer the phone? Come to the hospital as soon as you see this message." One urging text message after another kept coming. I simply turned off my phone and continued to watch the TV drama that I hadn't finished in the company lounge. Half an hour later, when the TV drama ended, I turned on my phone and found that all major online platforms were full of abuse against me. There were also many people doing live broadcasts. The live broadcast venue was exactly the hospital where my mother was. In the video, the attending doctor of my mother had tears in her eyes and was crying sadly. Aunt Jo would come to the hospital to see a doctor every few days. Every time she came, she was covered with injuries. It really made my heart ache. I really don't understand how her daughter could do such a thing to such a kind elder, beating her like this. Once, Aunt Jo choked with sobs and told me that she would rather die than go home. I thought she was just saying it casually. Unexpectedly, she actually jumped off the building and committed suicide. How much suffering did she have to endure to choose to take this step as such a positive and kind person? I called her daughter more than a dozen times, but she didn't answer, and she didn't reply to the text messages either. It seemed that her mother's death had nothing to do with her. How could there be such a cruel daughter in this world? As the attending doctor was speaking, she also played a video on her mobile phone. In the video, my mother spoke carefully, "Dr. Sophia, I'll give you my bank book. Can you let me stay in the hospital? I don't want to go home. My daughter beats me every day. If I go home again, I'll be beaten to death by her." My mother's eyes were full of tears, and her eyes were filled with horror and fear. The attending doctor couldn't help covering her face and crying bitterly. The popularity of the live broadcast room was rising steadily. All the bullet comments were lamenting my mother's death and abusing me, saying that I was not a human being as a daughter. Ethan was also there, kneeling in front of my mother's body and crying crazily to the camera. After Grace's father passed away, he divided all his property equally between Grace and her mother. But she wasn't satisfied with only having half and beat her mother every day, trying every means to force her mother to hand over the property in her hands. I married into her family. Grace looked down on me, a son-in-law who marries into the wife's family, from the bottom of her heart. Every time I advised her not to beat her mother, she would beat me too. As he was speaking, Ethan rolled up his sleeves and showed the bruises on his hands to the camera. To protect my mother-in-law, I've been beaten many times. I mentioned divorce, but Grace said that if I divorced, she would make my family have no good days. She has always been ruthless and knows a lot of people on the underworld. I can't compete with her and don't want to implicate my family, so I can only endure it again and again. But unexpectedly, she was so crazy that she forced her own mother to jump off the building and commit suicide. I really don't understand how there could be such a woman with a heart of a snake and a scorpion in this world. Like in the previous life, Ethan vehemently condemned all my so-called atrocities with vivid expressions. His heartbroken and aggrieved look made the viewers extremely angry. Oh my God, how could there be such a disgusting woman in this world? What a brute! Such a person is born to harm society. I'm really shaking with anger. Could some kind-hearted big brother get rid of this evil for the people? I can't even hold down my keyboard. The anger of the vast number of netizens was aroused, and they were all eager to put me to death. The power of being condemned by thousands of people is really terrifying. In the previous life, looking at my mother's body, my husband's betrayal, and the abuse all over the internet, my heart was completely crushed and I was unable to defend myself. As a result, I was wrongly imprisoned and tortured to death by the prisoners, but in this life, I will never repeat the same mistake. I put away my mobile phone and drove to the hospital where my mother jumped off the building. At this moment, the downstairs of the hospital inpatient department was crowded with people. I got out of the car silently and walked towards the crowd. Seeing that I had come, the already furious onlookers started yelling and cursing at me crazily. There were even many people spitting at me, throwing eggs and mud at me. Even the bullet comments in the live broadcast room were scrolling quickly with all kinds of nasty insults. The past was repeating itself. Instead of being affected in the slightest, I actually had a strange sense of anticipation in my heart. Good. The atmosphere was just right. The good show was officially starting. I ignored everyone and walked straight to the scene of the accident. Seeing that I had come, Ethan, who had been vehemently condemning me to the camera, immediately got excited. Grace, what on earth did you do to Mom? So much so that she would rather jump off the building than go home to face you. When you offered to accompany Mom to the hospital this morning, I thought you had a change of heart and were going to repent. Unexpectedly, you went from bad to worse and directly forced Mom to her death. She's your own mother. How could you be so cruel to her? Are you still human? Ethan was crying bitterly and couldn't wait to defend my mother. His look of hysterical pain and anger seemed so genuine that there wasn't a trace of falseness. Although I had already seen his crazy and unfamiliar appearance full of indignation in the previous life. In this life, I had also been mentally prepared. But looking at him, who had shared the same bed with me for many years, plotting so maliciously against me, I still couldn't help feeling a pang of sadness in my heart. Before I could say anything, the attending doctor of my mother also rushed towards me, full of indignation, and scolded, "Miss Grace, no matter how much you dislike your own mother, you shouldn't force her to death. She is the mother who gave birth to you and raised you. It's a human life. How could you be so cruel? Is the kindness of raising you really so insignificant in your eyes?" The attending doctor's emotions were also very much on point. The onlookers were all infected by her righteous condemnation and praised her one after another, but I just found it ridiculous. Looking at the two indignant people in front of me, I said calmly, "Have you two had enough of your performance?" This one sentence instantly left everyone in the audience stunned and confused. Ethan and the attending doctor also paused slightly. After exchanging a glance with each other, Ethan looked at me and frowned, saying, "What do you mean by that? Mom is dead, and you still think we are acting with you. There are both witnesses and evidence. Do you still want to quibble about your crimes?" Hearing this, everyone's emotions were stirred up again, and they cast scornful looks at me. The live broadcast bullet comments also crazily insulted me, saying I was a horrible person. I was too lazy to waste any more words on him. I directly threw out the information that I had asked my secretary to investigate in front of everyone and the live broadcast camera. There were intimate photos of Ethan and the attending doctor together. There were their closely related chat records. There were also various large amount transfers from Ethan to the attending doctor. I looked at Ethan and said coldly, "You two have been having an affair behind my back for a long time. Even her position in this hospital was arranged by you, right? In the previous life, I was immersed in the tenderness that Ethan pretended to have, and I never had any doubts about him. But when I thought about it carefully, everything that seemed ordinary actually had something unusual about it. For example, whenever my mother had a slight illness like a headache or a fever, Ethan would actively take her to this hospital. Even for a small problem that could be solved by taking medicine, Ethan would still, on the pretext of being worried, take the initiative to arrange for my mother to be hospitalized. And he was always happy to stay in the hospital every day, staying there for the whole day each time. When he came back, he looked as if he had been drained, but his face was still filled with a satisfied smile. But because both he and the attending doctor behaved so properly, I never thought much about it. Now that I think about it, they probably played a lot of underhanded tricks right under my nose. With my interrogation, the live broadcast camera quickly switched and clearly recorded the panic in Ethan's eyes. At this point, the tone of the bullet comments suddenly changed. Damn, look at her husband's reaction. It's obvious that he really has something going on with that doctor. I really didn't expect that this guy is also a scumbag. Sure enough, there are no men in this world who don't cheat. The onlookers at the scene also gave Ethan meaningful looks. But Ethan was fearless. He straightened his back and said righteously, "So what if all these are true? Wasn't it forced by you? You are like a shrew at home, either hitting or scolding me. I just found a gentle woman to soothe my wounded heart. Is there anything wrong with that? Besides, no matter how wrong I am, it's not a reason for you to force Mom to death." Hearing this, the attending doctor also chimed in. Right. You have a bad character and refuse to repent. And you are still investigating us here to shift the focus? Do you think you can clear the fact that you abused your mother and caused her to jump off the building and commit suicide like this? They sang the same tune and once again pinned the blame on me. The fickle onlookers and bullet comments started to point their fingers at me again and launched a crazy barrage of insults at me. Having been prepared for this, I directly took out my mobile phone. Then why don't we all take a look together and see what the so-called jumping off the building and committing suicide in your mouths is really like? With that, I played a surveillance video on my mobile phone in public. In the video, my mother and the attending doctor were standing on the rooftop of the top floor. After arguing for a few sentences, the attending doctor directly pushed my mother down the building forcefully. The whole process was smooth and without any hesitation. Seeing that my mother didn't move at all after falling on the ground, the attending doctor clapped her hands and left with a smile on her face. The surveillance video clearly and comprehensively recorded the whole process of the attending doctor's crime. After watching the video, the live broadcast bullet comments scrolled quickly. Damn, so her mother didn't jump off the building and commit suicide, but was deliberately killed by the attending doctor? This attending doctor is the real devil. She killed someone and then tried to shift the blame, slandering the daughter? Yeah, luckily there was surveillance. If this kind of murderer was allowed to run rampant in the hospital, God knows how many more patients would be harmed. The onlookers at the scene were even more furious. They gritted their teeth and glared at the attending doctor, looking as if they wanted to tear her apart. Obviously, the insane behavior of the attending doctor had completely enraged everyone. No one could imagine how many more innocent people would be persecuted if such a murderer was allowed to go unpunished. Under the angry stares of everyone in the audience, the attending doctor, who had been so arrogant just a moment ago, instantly panicked. She couldn't believe it and murmured, how could this be? Then, she pointed at me and said with certainty, "Your video must be fake. There is no surveillance on the top floor at all." Sure enough, the attending doctor had chosen the location in advance. She deliberately picked a secluded rooftop without surveillance to fake the appearance that my mother jumped off the building and committed suicide. As long as she didn't tell, no one would know the truth of this matter. But she didn't know that I was living my life again. I clearly remembered the time and place where this incident happened. So I asked my secretary to secretly install a hidden camera at that spot on the rooftop in advance. The purpose was to clearly record the whole story of the matter. It's just that I myself didn't expect that she would be so ruthless. In order to frame me, she even didn't hesitate to kill someone with her own hands. I looked at her and said coldly, "I've already submitted this video to the police. Whether it's true or false, we'll find out then." Hearing my words, the attending doctor's legs went weak and she staggered backward. Seeing this, Ethan immediately stepped forward to shift the blame again. He pointed at me, his face distorted as he cursed loudly, "Looking at you like this, it seems you knew long ago that Mom would end up like this? Is there anyone in the world who would be a daughter like you? Watching your own mother in danger of losing her life, not only not stopping it, but calmly watching the show? Is Mom's life not as important as your petty jealousy? No wonder you weren't the least bit sad when Mom died. I think you deliberately let Mom die just to get revenge on us." Ethan had an emotional outburst and once again shifted the focus. Hearing his words, the people at the scene and in the bullet comments were boiling again. Indeed. After all, she is the daughter. How could she act as if nothing had happened when her own mother died? Even if her mother's death had nothing to do with her, she is really cold-hearted, isn't she? Right. Probably blinded by jealousy, she doesn't even care about her own mother's life. Just looking at her indifferent face, I can tell she's definitely not a good person. It seems we didn't scold the wrong person after all. Ethan successfully aroused everyone's anger towards me and reversed the situation at the scene. However, I wasn't panicked at all. Instead, I silently dialed a phone number, "Bring the person here." Seeing me like this, Ethan frowned slightly and asked in confusion, "What are you up to now?" I remained calm and said, "Aren't you curious why I wasn't the least bit sad when my mother died? You'll find out soon." Immediately, everyone at the scene was intrigued by me. They were all looking forward eagerly, waiting to see how I would defend myself next. And Ethan just snorted coldly and said righteously, "Stop playing tricks here. Do you think you can change the fact that you're a despicable daughter like this? Mom's body is right here. Her wounds all over her body are clearly visible. Even if she didn't commit suicide, you can't escape responsibility." Ethan pointed at the body on the ground, with an air of confidence in his expression. It seemed that he had already achieved the final victory. I glanced at the body on the ground and said expressionlessly, "Are you sure there are really wounds on her body?" Hearing this, Ethan seemed to have heard the funniest joke and said with disdain, "Nonsense. I saw with my own eyes that you beat her every day. The wounds on her body never healed. Didn't expect that you still want to quibble at this point. Since that's the case, then I'll let everyone see how vicious you really are." With that, Ethan reached out and confidently rolled up my mother's sleeve. But there were no wounds on my mother's fair and clean arm at all. Seeing this, Ethan's eyes widened instantly. In disbelief, he rolled up the trouser leg. There were no old wounds on my mother's leg either. How could this be? Ethan was stunned. The onlookers were also stunned. Didn't they say that she was constantly abused by her daughter? She looks well taken care of to me, right? Her skin is even fairer than that of us young people. What on earth is going on? Could it be that what they said about the daughter abusing the mother is also false? Amid the confused murmurs of the people, the attending doctor hurriedly ran to the body, carefully examined the whole body of the corpse, and took a good look at the appearance. Finally, as if struck by lightning, she said in a trembling voice, "How could this be? No, it's impossible." After murmuring these two sentences with a pale face, the attending doctor suddenly hugged the body and broke down crying. Seeing this, the people at the scene were even more confused. What on earth is going on? Why does it seem that the attending doctor is as sad as if her own mother had died? Right. Didn't she push this person down the building and kill her with her own hands? What is she crying for now? Amid the various discussions of the people, the secretary walked over slowly with a person. Seeing this person, everyone at the scene widened their eyes. I got to know Ethan because of my father. One day, when my father was inspecting a construction site, he accidentally saw Ethan sweating all over while sifting sand and carrying bricks under the scorching sun. My father was puzzled and asked him why he was still working so hard when everyone else was taking a break because of the heat. After asking, he learned that Ethan was from a rural area. His parents were ill and hospitalized, and his family was in urgent need of money. So he was working 3 jobs a day and didn't dare to take a break. My father saw that he was honest and filial, so he immediately gave him a sum of money to pay for the medical expenses. He also hired him as his driver with a high salary and kept him by his side. Gradually, I had met Ethan a few times, but we weren't really familiar. The change in our relationship was due to an accident. That day, Ethan was driving my parents to a wine party. On the way, my mother had low blood sugar, so my father asked Ethan to buy some candies. Ethan parked the car on the roadside. He had just walked a few steps after getting out of the car when a runaway large truck crashed into my parents. My father died on the spot. My mother was seriously injured and hospitalized. At that moment, I felt like my whole world had collapsed. After muddling through my father's funeral in a daze, I spent all day crying and staying by my mother's side. For as many days as I stayed in the hospital to take care of my mother, Ethan accompanied me for the same number of days. Perhaps sensing that I harbored resentment towards him, he didn't say a word. He just stayed right by my side without leaving an inch. When I was crying sadly, he silently handed me tissues. When I had a stomachache, he carefully brought me hot water and stomach medicine. When I was feeling depressed, he firmly stayed with me and took care of me. Later, I was so exhausted that I fell ill. Ethan carried me home, took care of me during the day, and went to the hospital to look after my mother at night. In just a few days, Ethan visibly lost weight. Finally, when I was about to go to the hospital to continue taking care of my mother, Ethan brought my mother home from the hospital. Seeing that my mother had finally woken up, I felt that my life was bright again. Little did I know that the real darkness was just beginning. Perhaps it was due to the after effects of the injuries from the car accident. Or perhaps it was because of the shock of my father's death. After being discharged from the hospital, my mother seemed like a different person. Her personality had changed drastically, and she was moody. She often flew into a rage over the slightest thing. She drove all the nannies in the house away by scolding them. Sometimes, even the way she looked at me was as if I were her enemy. As long as I didn't do as she wished, she would be furious. The only person she liked at home was Ethan. She often told me that if it weren't for Ethan, she would have died in that car accident along with my father. And my favorable impression of Ethan also grew rapidly. We developed feelings for each other over time and finally walked into the marriage hall together. After marriage, Ethan had always been very good to me, gentle and attentive. He took care of me and my mother in every way he could. I once thought that he was a gift from heaven to me. He gave my mother a new life. He also gave me a wonderful life. But it turned out that all of this was fake. After the investigation by my secretary, I learned that Ethan had had an old flame a long time ago. It was Sophia, the attending doctor of my mother now. For so many years, Ethan and Sophia had been having an affair behind my back. The car accident that happened to my father was all planned by Ethan behind the scenes. The purpose was to let Sophia's mother replace my mother and enter my family. Yes. The one who had been living in my family after the car accident was always Sophia's mother. She was my mother's twin sister. Back then, when my grandmother gave birth to the two sisters, the family was poor and couldn't afford to raise both. So she cruelly gave away my mother, who was still in swaddling clothes. Later, my mother married my father and became a wealthy lady of a rich family. Sophia's mother suddenly noticed my mother. At that time, she was filled with jealousy, feeling that it was unfair. She thought that, for two people born of the same mother, why should she only live at the bottom of society while my mother could become a wealthy lady admired by everyone? With intense envy in her heart, she took Sophia to secretly observe my family's situation. Finally, they set their sights on Ethan. At that time, Ethan had just gained my father's trust. He drove around with my father all day long. It was also at that time that Sophia used herself to charm Ethan, making him head over heels for her. Finally, under the instigation of Sophia and her mother, Ethan designed that car accident for my father. So, the one Ethan brought home from the hospital in the end was not my mother. It was Sophia's mother. She lived the life of a wealthy lady in my family in place of my mother, and my mother had been imprisoned by Sophia in her house, never seeing the light of day. So Sophia's mother and Ethan often used the excuse of having allergies or being ill to meet Sophia in the hospital. Then they tried every means to beat and torture my mother. They beat her black and blue. But after such a long time, just doing this no longer satisfied them. So, they came up with this suicide accident today. To kill my mother. And then frame me. To kill two birds with one stone. After that, Ethan would inherit all my property in the name of my husband. Then the three of them could have a happy reunion openly and above board. I never knew that my mother had a twin sister. If it weren't for the strangeness of this jumping incident this time, I would never have suspected my mother's identity in my whole life. At this moment, the person brought by the secretary was my real biological mother. She looked exactly the same as the body on the ground, even the clothes and hairstyle were the same. At first glance, it was like a replica, only my mother's face was full of timidity. She was like a frightened bird that had been beaten too much. She looked at everyone with great caution. It wasn't until she saw me that her fearful eyes changed. Tears welled up in her eyes and streamed down her face. My heart was also filled with infinite longing and heartache. When the people at the scene saw my mother, they were completely dumbfounded. The live broadcast bullet comments were also full of question marks. Only Ethan and Sophia. Their eyes widened, looking shocked. "You're actually still alive?" Sophia was the first to react. She glared at my mother with furious eyes, her look extremely fierce. I shielded my trembling mother behind me and faced Sophia directly. "The middleman you prepared in the hospital for the switching of the babies had been bribed by me in advance. So the one you pushed downstairs was actually your own biological mother." My words were like a heavy hammer, smashing Sophia's heart to pieces once again. Although she had already recognized her mother's body just now, my words still had great impact, reminding her once again that it was she who had killed her own mother with her own hands. Her original intention was to make my mother a scapegoat, then shift all the blame onto me and kill me. In this way, she, my husband and her mother could live together openly and above board as a family of 3. But as a result, the one she killed was actually her own biological mother. This fact was unbearable for her. Ethan was also so angry that the veins on his forehead stood out. He glared at me with hatred and cursed loudly. "You woman, you are really so cruel-hearted. Even if Auntie isn't your biological mother, you have lived together for so many years. Speaking of the relationship, you should even call her your little aunt. How could you just watch her die in vain like this?" I looked straight at Ethan and said word by word, "Now you know to bring up the relationship and talk about feelings? When you killed my father, abused my mother and tried to frame me, why didn't you think about this relationship? Yes, we have lived together for many years. But over the years, has she ever looked at me properly? She treated me like an enemy and never had a kind face towards me. Do you know how I suspected her today? Just because on the way of sending her to the hospital, she was unusually gentle and said that I was her proud and precious daughter. This was so unusual that I had someone investigate her background. While saying this, I glanced at the body on the ground and said coldly to Sophia, "I saw in the surveillance video that you and your mother argued a few words on the rooftop. At that time, she should have been trying her best to explain her identity, right? I really didn't expect that you, as a daughter, could be so murderous that you didn't even bother to listen to her explanation and directly pushed your own biological mother downstairs." Hearing me say this, Sophia's eyes bulged out and she stared at me fixedly. "Grace, aren't you really afraid of getting retribution?" I looked puzzled. "Shouldn't I be the one asking you this question? My mother had no enmity with you. Why did you abuse her for a long time, beat her all over with bruises and even try to kill her? And it was you who killed your mother with your own hands. Why should I get any retribution?" Thinking of the previous life, my father was kind enough to help Ethan, but Ethan repaid kindness with ingratitude and killed him alive. My mother was kind all her life, but was abused for so many years and was pushed downstairs by Sophia and died a miserable death without knowing why. I did nothing wrong, but was framed by Sophia and Ethan, wrongly imprisoned and beaten to death. Our family of 3 was simply reduced to stepping stones for their 3 insatiable desires. Died a tragic death in vain. Looking at this life, the 3 of them were still trying to kill us at all costs. Facing such extremely vicious people, I really couldn't find any reason to be soft-hearted towards them. My words completely enraged Sophia. "I'll kill you." With that, she was about to rush over and attack me. But just at this moment, the police suddenly arrived. They went straight to Sophia and, "We received a report that you 2 are suspected of illegally imprisoning and abusing others, slandering and defaming, and intentional killing. Please come with us." Sophia and Ethan were taken away by the police amid the curses and spits of everyone. Due to their heinous crimes and huge public opinion pressure, they were soon sentenced to death. And I, with my mother, started a new life. After treating all her wounds, I took my mother